I'd like to take great pleasure in introducing John Knights, LeaderShape Global's chairman and the lead author of Leading Beyond the Ego, How to Become a Transpersonal Leader. Initially, John had a fast-track corporate career to corporate VP of a Fortune 100 company, after which he founded several businesses of his own. His life changed in 1998 when he had the opportunity to learn to coach other chief executives and to start to understand the real issues around leadership. Nowadays, his passion and purpose is to support leaders on their journey to become excellent transpersonal leaders. Today's webinar will familiarize you with the value of taking the journey towards transpersonal leadership, as well as giving you a practical sense of how to embark on it to gain the benefits for your own organization. So I will now hand over to John and look forward to this webinar.
So why this book? Two main reasons. First, we're not getting the right leaders running our organizations. And second, our fast-changing world requires a new kind of leader, a more complete leader. This book is packed with detail and new learning. So join us for the next hour for a whistle-stop tour of the transpersonal leadership journey. The foundation of transpersonal leadership are these three levels of intelligence: emotional, spiritual, and rational. And we can see that if we look at those three intelligences on this Venn diagram, we can see that if you combine rational and emotional intelligence, that's where the enhancing performance is created. Where you connect emotional intelligence to spiritual intelligence is where you get the caring and the sustainable part of leadership. And when you combine rational and spiritual is when you get the ethical. However, it's only the sweet spot in the middle that we call transpersonal leadership. And transpersonal leaders, they operate beyond their ego. They continue personal development and learning. They're radical, ethical, authentic, while emotionally intelligent and caring. They create performance enhancing and sustainable cultures. Quite a tall order. The purpose of the book is to explain what transpersonal leadership is, and in detail how you can become a transpersonal leader. It also takes into account the fact that the world is changing rapidly, more rapidly than ever before, that we have new generations of young people and future leaders coming into the workplace, the millennials and the Z generation, that have a totally different approach to work and life than previous generations. We have globalization, which means a whole different attitude towards multiculturalism. We have many changes in society. Diversity is moving very fast, and of course, women in the workplace are an important issue. And in addition to that, we have and need a new way of learning. The old rote system of teach and preach just doesn't work anymore in this modern world. There's just too much information to be that needs to be available, and we can't keep it all in our head. So we have to be in a position where we can better utilize the information that's available outside, and that requires a different kind of learning. It needs us as leaders to be able to help people to pull them towards us rather than to push them in the direction we want them to go. Now let's look first, let's now have our first poll. So what this is saying is, yes, there is going to be a big challenge around artificial intelligence, but also we need to think about the multi-generational organizations and societal attitudes, which are largely behavioral issues and issues around ethics and values. Okay, so let's look at the structure of the book. It assumes that the reader has business skills and understands something about strategy. So, because that is what we call the foundation level, that is a threshold level that people need to be leaders, but is not what we consider leadership itself. So part one of the book is what we call the intermediate level of transpersonal leadership, which is about raising awareness of self and others, about learning to manage emotions, and about developing performance-enhancing behaviors. Part two of the book, the advanced level, is more about values and bringing those values to full consciousness, how we manage our ego, and how we make better decisions and judgments and choices. And part three is about how we implement transpersonal leadership development programs. Looking at it another way, this book is focusing on emotional intelligence and spiritual intelligence, or we also refer to it as ethical intelligence. So the first part of the book is where we can see this column of Real One. It's about creating a leader who is robust and emotionally aware. And to do that, we specifically talk about behaviors and leadership styles and shaping a performance-enhancing culture. Part two of the book, which is where we can see Real 2, the mnemonic that we use, Real, that we at the end of the second part of the book, we will have created, if the individual follows the program, a radically, ethically authentic leader. And to do that, we discuss values, ethics, and judgment beyond the ego for the greater good and embedding an ethical culture. We can look at it in a third way. The journey, the entire journey, is split into 17 modules. The first 7 are part 1 of the journey, the intermediate, and 10 steps for the transpersonal part, the advanced part of the journey. If we first look at the intermediate level, that's part 1 of the book. This is an important foundation for the advanced journey. And we're going to run through this fairly quickly so that we can spend more time focused on the advanced. The first thing to remember is that we humans today are basically born with the same brain as Stone Age man, both men and women. We're programmed for survival and crisis. We're continuously rewired, though, through our lives. And that may be through education, but it's also through experience, which is often serendipitous and by chance. We also have a tendency to go back to default, to what is our instinct. So a typical leader will go back to wanting to know everything and telling people what to do as a default. And this, I'm sure all of you can think about when you're in a stress situation or when you're angry, when you're emotionally hijacked, that's the kind of state that you might revert to. The thing that we can do about this, though, is that we can actually learn to proactively rewire our own brain so that we can actually learn to control the way we are. Now, that doesn't mean that we change our personality, not at all. But what it does mean is that we learn to manage our personality more effectively. And that will help us to move away from this Stone Age default, which is to amplify the negative, to do more of the same, to prepare for the worst and exhibit powerful emotions, which are fine in a situation of survival and crisis. But that is not generally how we the state that we are living in today's modern world, specifically as an organizational leader. If we look in more detail about how to manage our emotions, I want to show you just 4 important parts of the brain that are involved in emotional management. The first part is the thalamus, which receives our senses, the stimulus from our senses, so from sight, from hearing, from touch, etc. Now the thalamus then sends impulses it sends it to the amygdala, but there are 3 routes it can take. It can either take that very short, fast route, direct route, or it can take a long, slower route through the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. Now, the advantage of it going through the prefrontal cortex is that that gives time for us to have a rational consideration about how to deal with that stimulus. And if further it goes through the hippocampus, which is where our memory bank is, it can help us to reflect on past memories that will help us to make the right kinds of decisions based on our experience. The problem is that the natural tendency is for that impulse to go directly from the thalamus to the amygdala, especially when it's a very strong emotional impulse. So emotional self-control is about managing that process. Now, emotional intelligence is a science of managing emotions. It's well documented, it's well known, and it's discussed in detail in this book. But I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think that many of you will have some familiarity. And if you're not, then by all means, you can read the detail in the book. But what I would like to say is that there are basically 4 emotional intelligence competencies that you can see here. And within that are a range of EI capabilities, ranging from self-confidence to adaptability, to empathy, to conflict management, etc. And these are all underpinned by granular behaviors. And I'm just going to give you one example. We're going to have a look at empathy. So this is what we call the empathy circle. And there are basically 4 granular behaviors attached to empathy. The first, in the top right-hand corner there, is to listen attentively. Now, this is something that most leaders will know today that is very important to do. Whether they do it when they're in action, that's another thing. But most people are aware of the need to listen attentively. And there are certainly many techniques one can use to be able to achieve that. The second one, though, demonstrate an awareness of feelings, which is basically the feedback that you've heard, is something that most leaders do not do. And in fact, we found that this is the #1 development need amongst all leaders, is to feedback what you've heard and show that you're aware of that other person's feelings. And then the third is to identify the cause of that person's perspective, of their view, and to then feedback what you've heard. So when we break down empathy into these 4 granular behaviors, we can very easily see that it's something that we can work on doing and changing. Whereas when we look at empathy in the round as a big word, as a big topic, it's very difficult to know where to start. So this is where personal self-development, either with a coach or within a team, really begins to work. Now, how these emotional intelligence competencies and capabilities and granular behaviors manifest themselves are in these 6 leadership styles. And each style depends on 2 or 3 specific capabilities. So, for example, coaching depends on empathy, it depends on developing others, and it depends on self-awareness. Now, each of us have 1 or maximum 2 natural styles. They are styles that we feel comfortable with and we use most of the time, and that we're rather good at. That's the sort of in the round situation. The reality is, though, that in order to be able to lead in all situations, we need to be able to use all 6 leadership styles. And what we've discovered is that no one are fully competent in all 6 styles. Everyone needs to develop 1 or 2 or 3 granular behaviors to be able to round themselves off so that they can have this whole set of leadership styles that they can use in any circumstance, and also know when to use it as well, which is very important. And the book goes into that into great detail. So once we've got those 6 leadership styles, what do we do next? How does that move towards performance enhancement in an organization? So it's about how to use those styles correctly. And basically, a leader sets a climate when they come into an organization, which in turn, over a period, will enable the employees to develop the culture, which then creates the performance, the organizational performance. And depending on which way that goes, if it goes from the leadership downwards, we can call that transformational leadership. Whereas if it's the environment or the organizational performance that's requiring us to change the culture, then we call that transactional leadership. To give you an idea of what we mean by climate and culture, let's consider what are probably 2 of the most famous people in the world over this century, which would be Presidents Obama and Trump of the United States. Just think for a moment, and I'm not going to give any personal opinions here, but just think for a moment about when they came to power, what was the climate that they set? And what culture is being created or was created as a result of that? And finally, what are the results? So if you ponder on that for a moment, you can see how the leader's climate, either a single leader or a team of leaders, can have a huge impact on an organization that can be either positive or negative. So let's look at culture in a slightly different way. We divide culture into 4 parameters: power, structure, achievement, and support. And by measuring these different parameters, we can identify what is the actual culture in an organization, but we can also identify what people would like as an ideal culture. And what we find is that in most organizations, the power parameter is too high, the structure parameter is too high, the achievement parameter is low, and the support parameters are low. So that in broad terms is where people want to change. And what we've identified almost, well, anywhere in the world and in almost all organizations is that this model that you see in front of you is generally what people want as the ideal culture. They want plenty of achievement and they want plenty of support with little power and less structure. And it's interesting that the fact that this goes across all cultures and all countries, it shows that this is a human requirement rather than a cultural or a tribal one. So we've learned to manage our emotions and develop new behaviors and leadership styles and create a performance-enhancing culture. But alone, that is not enough. Because, of course, as we know, emotional intelligence and the managing of emotions can be done in a manipulative way as well as in a positive way. And the advanced level is what sort of takes us to the next level of leadership, which is to make sure that we do this on a values-based way. So the advanced level is about bringing our values to full consciousness. It's about learning to manage our ego. And it's about creating ethical and sustainable cultures as well as just performance-enhancing ones. So we developed this model called the 8 Integral Competencies of Leadership, which covers the entire journey. And you'll see that we've already talked about the intellect and logic. Personal preferences, they're the things that are innate in us. If you look at the top and top left quadrants, no, not quadrants, but segments there. And then on the right-hand side, we have the 4 emotional intelligence competencies. But there are 2 competencies left that we haven't dealt with yet. And that is what we call the values-based competencies of self-determination and personal conscience. And that is what we're going to focus on in the advanced part of the journey. So bringing these values to full consciousness. First of all, personal conscience values. This is about who I am. And then we have the self-determination values, which is about what am I going to do with who I am. If we look at the left-hand column just briefly, we can see that there are a list of about 12 there, and there are 4 that come up time and time again when in employee studies asking what they require of their leader, what come up as the top of the list. And they're trustworthiness, truth and honesty, excellence and integrity. Not surprising. They want people to be good and true. But what we mustn't forget as leaders is that we also need those softer values: humility, vulnerability, fairness, forgiveness, etc. And altruistic love, which means love your fellow man, but excludes obviously a romantic kind of love. So these are the list of values that on the left-hand column that we've found are the most important for a leader. They're not exclusive. There are many other values that people can add and may have their personal favorites. If we look on the right-hand side, we can see these self-determination values. So these are all action-oriented. And you might call this or we call it anyway, the ultimate leadership competency. Because without this, we can't put our values into action. And that is often what's missing in leadership. So what drives us? If we look at the cat and the mouse and the imagination that actually I'm a lioness capturing a wild beast, a wildebeest maybe even, it's possible that our ego can run wild and we can believe that we're better than we are, or that we're more important than we are. And there are 4 main drivers that allow us to do that. And these are power, prestige, recognition, and reward. So bear in mind that ego, by our definition, is that part of ourselves that is based on our self-image and only interested in our own personal benefit. So based on that, let's now move to pole 2. I look, what is important for them is what other people think of you. And that is something to really bear in mind. It's not that there's anything wrong with it at all. It's human nature. But if we are aware of it, then there will be times when we will need to manage it. So let's move on to that. So looking at leading beyond our ego, we can be at the mercy of our ego and just think about what's important for us. Or we can be more transpersonal and think of the interests of all the stakeholders in our organization. So there will come times, many times during a career, when we will have to choose between what is best for us personally and what is best for the organization. Often the decision is fairly easy, but other times it won't be, particularly if you're in a period of time where the career is very important, where certain things are happening in your family life, etc., etc. But what we must always remember is that actually we're being paid by the organization to take decisions that are for the best interest of the organization and for the organization's stakeholders. And when I talk about the organization's stakeholders, I'm basically talking about employees, clients, customers, suppliers, the community, and even the planet. And I think that we have to really bear that in mind when we're making our decisions. Is it best for us or is it best for them? And it's not necessarily even going to be a moral decision, but often we will take a decision subconsciously that benefits our own ego rather than bringing the issue to full consciousness to make the right decision. And I think we need to look at the just a moment at the long-term consequences, potential long-term consequences of this. For example, at the moment, there's a big issue about plastics in the ocean. And that's basically because we didn't think of the planet as an important stakeholder 30, 40 years ago when we started producing plastics. The next may be that we're not considering the universe. Already, there's loads of debris in the in the outer reaches of the Earth's atmosphere, which could cause a fatal accident. So it must also be thinking long-term rather than short-term, as well as personal versus stakeholder. So on that note, let's move to poll number 3 to get your opinions. In our experience, the private sector tends to choose customers as number 1. Public sector often chooses employees as number 1.
And I think what's also interesting is that nobody has chosen shareholders,
yeah,
which is what's taught in business school.
That's right, absolutely. Which maybe we're moving forwards in some ways. But what is important is that the community and the planet is there are quite a material portion of people who consider those 2 areas the most important, and just maybe a few people think the senior executives. But I think this is really important to just think as a bear in mind. It's an exercise you can do in your own organization. What we find is that when we get a group of leaders together and we ask this question, it's usually something they've never considered. And often in a team of leaders, you'll get everybody having a different view, which is makes for a very interesting discussion, especially when most of them have already agreed on the vision and strategy of the organization. So in order to do this, we need to be making good decisions. So how do we make good judgments and the best decisions? Well, one of the things that's really important to know is that there are 5 decision-making processes in our brain. And the one that we use nearly all the time is the one at the top there, rational logic, which is our only conscious decision-making process. The reality is, though, that most of our decisions are made subconsciously, and we use our rational logic to explain or justify the decision. So it's really important to know how we're making our decisions. It can be through intuition, which is based on our personal experience. It can be instinct, which is based on our innate DNA, and one can say the experience of our forefathers, maybe. Or it can be through insight, which is an external but voluntary stimulus that suddenly comes to us, maybe in the shower. And then the fourth one, which is really important, is our ethical philosophy. There are three basic choices in ethical philosophy. Do we base our philosophy and our decision-making on integrity? Do we base it on social conscience? In other words, what's important for the people around us? Or do we do it based on the rules? And interestingly, in research and studies that have gone around the world and hundreds of thousands of people, about a third of the population choose each of those three. So this is a really quite complex subject, but it's also really important for a leader to be able to understand and to bring those unconscious processes to as much consciousness as possible. Because in each of those processes, there are biases and prejudices. And we must unearth those if we're going to make the right kinds of decisions. Quite often, we use the term gut instinct. Well, it's a lot more complex than that. And there are always, and where some people will think that, always go by your gut instinct. That's not always right, because there are quite often prejudices and biases built in, which we need to understand and to be able to extract before we make the final decision. The other context that we need to bring in here around our decision making and bringing our values to full conscious is, what is our purpose? If we look at this diagram, we can see that purpose is at the pinnacle. And without having a purpose, we're at the mercy of our ego. So the first thing that we need, looking from at the bottom, is we need to be in the right environment. If we're not in the right environment, then it's very unlikely that whichever organization we're in is going to have a purpose or anything that is aligned with our own purpose. Obviously, we need a certain level of IQ to be able to develop a purpose. We need the right behaviors so we can put that purpose into action. We need the beliefs and values as a foundation for our purpose so that we get the right kind of purpose, something that is greater than who we are as individuals. And then finally, we need to know who we are. So if we move on and look a little bit more into purpose, I want to just give you a few minutes to read these 4 statements and to write down your answers from 1 to 5, depending on whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree. And then we'll move on to another poll. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to read those through, write down your answers. So let's move on to the next poll. So do you have a clearly defined purpose for yourself? A purpose but not clearly defined? Perhaps you realize you need to develop a purpose, or maybe you haven't even thought about developing a purpose, or finally you may think developing a purpose is pointless. we've discussed a few of the elements on the journey. Obviously, there are many other elements and steps that we have not had time to discuss in this short webinar. But the final one that I want to go into is about how we make those difficult decisions using a different mechanism so that they're value-based and beyond the ego. And what we do is we call a touchstone. And a touchstone is a standard by which something is judged. Now, the one on the screen here that you can see is actually, it's an example, but it's mine. It's my touchstone. So on the right-hand side, we've got these 7 transpersonal qualities, which are fixed. If you're going to be a transpersonal leader, they're fixed. And then on the left-hand side, we've chosen 6 values that are particularly important for that individual. It may be, you may have 5, you may have 7, but 6 is about the right kind of number that you can hold on to without it becoming too complex an exercise. Now, what I've chosen these 6 where integrity, fairness, and resilience are the 3 which are sort of natural to me and really feel part of who I am. And the others, humility, altruistic love, and courage, are the 3 that I particularly aspire to, that I work on, that I really want to be better at. And they're things that I perhaps sometimes forget about if I'm not conscious about it. So it makes it a very important exercise for me. So if we move on to, let's have a look at, so what is a good touchstone for you? So we have the right-hand column completed, and now we can see about filling in the left-hand column. We've split personal conscious values into the hard and the soft values that I discussed before. And we've got the self-determination values, which are on the right-hand side there. Now, to start this exercise, let's go to the final poll.
Just coming up now.
So from each of the following lists, 3 lists, choose 2 values which you believe are the most core to who you are or aspire to be. You can scroll, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say you can scroll down to see the rest of the options for the 3 sections. There's the results. Let's share those.
Okay, so if we look at section 1, we can see that integrity is by far the most important to you guys. Section 2, consciousness, but quite high on fairness and humility. Interestingly, quite low on vulnerability. That's a very, we don't have time for it today, but that's a very interesting subject to discuss, which of course is handled in the book in quite some detail. And then section 3, purpose is the highest of those self-determination values, followed by motivation and drive. So hopefully
CPD, John.
And CPD, sorry, CPD is high as well, which is again, perhaps we've got a self-selecting audience here in that in continuous development. But I think that will hopefully just give you a little insight into how to develop a touchstone and how that can help you make decisions that are consistent with your own core values and with becoming a transpersonal leader.
So I'll stop sharing that now and we can move towards the last section.
So what we must remember is only we humans, at least as far as science knows at the moment, have a free choice that we can make in full consciousness. So let's take full advantage of that ability that we have. Let's use it for our families, our organizations, for the planet, and yes, even for ourselves. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're now going to move into the Q&A section, but while we do that, we'd like to remind you that the book is available on the Routledge website with a 20% discount using that code, and obviously also available on places like Amazon, but the code only works on the Routledge website. So we'll move towards the Q&A section now. So we have one from Jeffrey Swannell, John. Where do the leadership styles come from? Is there an assessment instrument?
Yes, well, okay. So these 6 styles are basically from the Goleman-Boyatzis model that was developed in the early 2000s. And the reason we use that model is because it integrates very nicely with the emotional intelligence capabilities, which also is a Goleman-Boyatzis model, but it integrates nicely with the culture model that is by different people, by Ogbana and Harris, for example. And the leadership styles are just a nice transition between that helps us to go all the way from granular behaviors through to the performance enhancing culture, and hence the performance of the organization. And yes, there is certainly a tool for analysis. We have developed our own tool called LEAPER, which is the Leadership and Emotional Intelligence Performance Accelerator, which is a 360 tool. And it not only measures the granular behaviors, but also provides a matrix between the importance of the different leadership styles in your job versus the competence of those leadership styles. So you can actually identify where the gap is between competence and importance. And you can then go back and find out maybe 1 or 2 or 3 granular behaviors that you can work on that will have a huge impact on your leadership competence.
John, another question that we had, which is worth repeating today, is how do you select people for leadership roles that are likely to be open to developing or along that road towards being transpersonal leaders to help create the right climate in your organization?
So how do we identify them?
Yes, how would we start to identify those people in a hiring or development process?
Okay, so this is a really important question because today, I think most organizations do not start to identify people who would be transpersonal leaders. So the first thing is to identify whether people have values. I mean, that's the #1 thing. And secondly, to identify that they're not a sociopath, because the problem is that many people who are good at getting to the top are able to do it without good values, and sometimes without particularly good emotional intelligence as well, although some are able to use that emotional intelligence manipulatively. So I would say that to make sure that assertiveness, for example, that people like does not turn to being aggressive, and that political intrigue and sophistication is not what gets people to the top, but actually competence in leadership, so that when people get to the top, they're actually good leaders. And that's something that's really failing today.
Could you give an example of how a new leader coming into a role impacts the climate so quickly that a different culture results quite rapidly?
So let's think of perhaps the 2 most famous people in the world at the moment, I guess, and that's Presidents Obama and Trump. And you can just think about what was the climate they set when they first came in to becoming president. What were the things, what were the behaviors they did, what were the things they were saying would happen, et cetera, et cetera. And how does that played out? how is that changing the culture of not only the administration, but of the country? And also, what were or are the results of that? And we can see two different people. I'm not going to make any opinions here, but you can see two different people who are both, the top leaders of the free world, so to speak, and they have totally different approaches to setting a climate. They may not even aware that they were setting a climate, but they certainly have done.
Thank you, John. We have two new questions. One from Mark asking, have we created a slide deck presentation to win senior leader buy-in, which speaks to value drivers in financial terms, so needing data from studies, etc. Now, obviously, we have our own case studies, and I'll let you answer that, but it may be a good thing for Mark to pick up with us offline.
Yeah, but I would just say that one major organization where we spent some time with the senior leadership who were trying to develop an ethical culture in the organization. They weren't sure exactly how to do that, or even how they were going to convince the people that in the organization that it was important. And they'd done all this sort of the compliance stuff. They did all the box ticking and et cetera, but they didn't feel that people were really buying into these things. So when we held these series of workshops, what we were basically asking them to do is to tell us, so what would an ethical culture look like? And they created about 14 or 15 statements that they thought it would look like. And then we asked the question, and how many of these are good for business? And the result was all of them. Now that case study is in the book, but I think that is just something that shows that we were able to move away from pure pounds and dollars, and that the value drivers have to be also about the long term. So yes, in a word, we do have a kind of slide deck. We do have an approach. We do have a methodology for doing that.
And we'll be happy to speak to you offline about it as well, Mark, if you want some more specific communication. So we've now got a question from Bev asking, what is the process to be followed when the leader espouses the right values but doesn't live them? So in other words, they don't walk the talk.
Well, that's I would say that's quite a common problem. And if they're at the top of an organization, the senior leaders, then I guess it's really only the board of directors who can correct that. That's one of the problems, is that quite often boards of directors are just not informed well enough about these kind of things, about how to check up on these things. If people are at a lower level in the organization, then we have to have systems in the organization so that part of the assessment or appraisal system, or whatever you want to call it, has to include not only the objectives, the business objectives to be met, but also the behavioral objectives and the values objectives. And they can be, then people can be, will be required to give examples of where they showed those values rather than where they talked about them. Okay, next question.
From Geeta, John, have we found any difference in the qualities of leadership and ego factors being different for men versus women?
Okay, so I don't think we've done sufficient study on ego to be able to differentiate between men and women. But what we have done is we've done a lot of studies on emotional intelligence. And our studies show that out of those 19 EI capabilities, women on average, and of course this is stereotyping, so it's not talking about any individual, but on average, women are better than men in 15 of those 19. So I wouldn't be surprised to find that women have less of an ego factor than men, but we haven't done the study.
But also we found that women are generally lower in self-assurance, self-confidence than men, and that potentially could be linked to ego. But as John says, we don't have any definitive answer.
Yeah.
So thank you, Geeta. Susanna has a couple of questions. John?
Regarding the measurement mentioned earlier on, do you mean Boyatz's scale as the Case Western University? The leadership styles are based on the research of Boyatz's, which was popularized by Goleman. So I would imagine it is the same.
And we obviously, using our LEAPER tool, we identify strengths and weaknesses in people's potential repertoire of leadership styles based on their behaviors and their emotional intelligence competencies. And that may not be exactly the same as Boyatz's scale, although it's based on the same research.
I think that a couple of things that's, I think, fairly unique about our the tool that the LEAPER tool that we used. I mean, basically, if we'd have found something in the marketplace that that we could use to our satisfaction, we wouldn't have developed our own. But a couple of things that are different about it. One is that we observe both the actual behavior of the individual and the desired behavior of the individual. So what we're looking at is the differential. We're not looking at a sort of a global standard to compare with, because we found and believe that that is kind of irrelevant when you're comparing a pig farmer in Texas with an IT specialist in China.
Okay.
How far?
Susanna's other question is, how far are these ethical attributes that create the climate are well tested?
Yeah, that's good too. Good question. I think that some of them they're not tested in a psychometric sense. What they're tested in is an observed sense, and how people react, and how people how people perform as a result of them, and how they create the right kind of environment. But there is still a lot of work to be done on evidence-based research around these ethical attributes.
Okay, thank you very much, John. I think that's the last of the questions. So we'd just again like to thank everybody for joining us today, and hope you found the session thought-provoking. John, do you want to put the final slide?
Put the sign on, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, just to say these are some of the endorsements and feedback we've had on the book. And we hope that we'll hear from you again, and that you'll give us your feedback. We look forward to you attending future webinars. Thank you very much for your attention this afternoon.
Thank you very much. And goodbye. Have a nice evening, or a nice day, as the case may be.